Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. It is the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar, New Year, New Information Governance Goals. We appreciate you all joining us today, and the first thing I'd like to do is take a second and introduce our speakers. My name is Shana Horka, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at Gimmel, and I'm joined by our key speaker, Director of Sales Engineering, Dean Meisenheimer. Before we get started with today's presentation, I have just a couple of housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we will answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There will be at least one poll question that you will see pop up, so please keep an eye out for that. And as always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you.
All right. Thanks, Shana. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. It is a new year, new information governance strategy. So let's talk a little bit about first what information governance is. You see a lot of words up here on the screen. Is information governance a product, a technology? It's really a combination of things, right? We're all familiar with these terms: records management, archival, email management, retention management, rights management. It's a variety of things, right? And these are all technologies. These are all terms we know, and they've been around for years. So let's take a look at what ARMA says information governance is. If you go to arma.org, this is kind of their definition of what information governance is. It's described as the overarching and coordinating strategy for all organizational information. And it establishes authorities, supports, processes, capabilities, structures, and infrastructure to enable information to be a useful asset and a reduced liability to an organization. And those are kind of the two key words in there, right? Are make information an asset and reduce its potential to be a liability to the organization, right? Information governance brings together a lot of different things to build that infrastructure. So if you look at your own organization, how would you define information governance? Right? Building that information governance foundation really takes a combination of things. And it kind of boils down to a combination of people, the business processes, and the technology. If you leave out any one of these three things, your chances of success are going to be lower, right? It really takes a combination of all three. Any technology, whether we're talking about information governance, or any other type of technology is really just an enabler to make things better, to make things easier. But technology by itself typically doesn't solve a problem. How the technology is used becomes important, right? What type of business processes you wrap around how that technology is used, how repeatable and scalable those processes are, matter. And then the people involved in the business process. Right, you have to get buy-in from people in the organization. How many projects, whether they're IT projects or others, have struggled because the people impacted by that project or the people impacted by that change didn't buy into the process, didn't buy into the reason for the change. If people are part of the process, if people are part of the change management, if people see benefits from the change, then they'll buy in, and your chances of success are extreme, are much, much higher. And so that kind of brings us to, a top level view of information governance. At Gimmel, we've been around for 18 years, and we've learned a few things along the way about information governance. We started out as a consulting firm focused on solving problems for our clients around compliance and information governance. And that really gave us kind of a unique view and an expertise and an objectivity on what it takes to have a successful solution. We've used that experience to both build out our own solutions and our own products and to deliver those types of solutions to our clients. And the goal is to provide a balance, right? Balance the value that the information brings with the risk that the information presents. And, just like any scale, right? You can't go too heavy on one side or the other, or the scale will tilt. If you put too much focus on mitigation of risk, systems become so locked down and so cumbersome that your user community doesn't want to use them, and they start looking for ways around the system, right? If you put too much emphasis on the value and don't have any controls in place, you expose yourself to risk, right? And expose yourself to penalties that can come with that. So there has to be a balance between managing the risk, having an acceptable management of the risk, and doing it in a way that embraces your user community and gets them engaged. So that brings us to our first poll question. Do you have an information governance strategy in place? And you should see a pop-up here on the window. Pick your answer, and we'll be showing you the answers here in real time. Yes, you have an information governance strategy. No, there's not one. Or you have one in development, right? You currently have, let's say, a project in flight to kind of develop a strategy. Let us know where you guys are at in your information governance journey, and we'll kind of take a look and see the results here in just a minute. And then we'll begin to get into more of the meat of the presentation and just talk a little bit about some of the challenges and the various ways to kind of get started on the information governance journey. So let's see the poll results. Interesting. So about half of you do have an information governance strategy in development. That's great. And of the other half, it's pretty equally split. A quarter of you say yes, you have a strategy. Another quarter say no. So that's really good numbers, quite frankly. So 75% either have a strategy or are in development of one. So glad you're here today. Hopefully we can open your eyes to a few things to take into consideration. So what are some of the challenges? Why do we care about information governance, right? Well, I don't think I'm telling anybody anything that's a huge surprise. 2020 was a challenging year for a lot of reasons, right? A lot of employees who never worked from home before suddenly found themselves for the last 10 months working at home, at their kitchen table, their dining table, sitting on their couch, wherever it may be. But they suddenly found themselves transitioned to being a work-at-home worker. Some of us have been road warriors for years, right? We're used to working from home or hotels or Starbucks or customer sites, and we understand some of the challenges that go with that. But for employees who've never worked from home, suddenly there's a whole new rash of problems. One, just kind of balancing home and work together, right? Carving out a space to work in, balancing getting work done and feeling like you're leaving work at the end of the day, or balancing getting your work done and yet you've got a family, you may have kids at home doing their their own version of work at home, doing schoolwork, right? So there becomes this balance. And now suddenly you have to deal with new IT infrastructure you may not have had to deal with before. VPN access to get a secure connection to your company's network and access the systems that you need, right? That's all new for a lot of workers, and it can be frustrating, especially at first, right? A lot of people, suddenly are much more experts at Zoom and Teams and WebEx than they ever were before, right? Because they've had to learn it. And that also put a burden, quite frankly, on IT. Again, companies who didn't have a work-at-home culture because it wasn't necessarily part of their business model suddenly had to react very, very quickly. I know of companies that their first order of business, quite frankly, was to get and procure laptops for a lot of their employees so they could work at home, and to set up VPN connections and that secure access and make sure systems were available, to users working from home, and that took time. And as a result, quite frankly, sometimes you're trying to get things done, you're in a hurry, you want to share stuff. There's a lot of things going on, and sometimes you just take the path of least resistance. You share information. Instead of putting it in the corporate repository, you put it in your Dropbox and you share it with somebody because it's just easier, it's quicker. Or you use your Gmail because you can't connect to the corporate Exchange server, or shortcuts begin to happen. And that really gets into some of the challenges, that that are brought out and recognized by IT executives, right? In a study on data governance trends, IT executives, really felt like remote work is one of the main culprits in driving data sprawl, right? Suddenly, with kind of a much more distributed workforce than normal, people are putting information in lots more places because they're just trying to get things done, right? And so data sprawl becomes a much bigger issue than potentially it was before. Quite frankly, it's always been a challenge, but potentially even more so now. And as a result, sensitive information especially, may not be being protected the way it needs to be, right? 70% of IT execs are concerned that employees are not necessarily following the policies and procedures to keep files and documents secure. If I send you something through my Gmail, do I forget to delete it later, or does it start getting distributed that way? Or if I put something in Dropbox, do I forget to remove it, put it into SharePoint later where it needs to be? And that led to some of these top concerns, things like increased risks of data breach or, quite frankly, leaks of information, and managing access to information effectively, managing the permissions around information, right? If I'm not putting it into the corporate repository, is it being secured so that only the right people can see that information the way they should? And how do I get visibility into all of that? Think about your organization. Think about how many data sources you have across your network, both in your network and in the cloud, that you have information in. You may have SharePoint Online, SharePoint on-premise, OneDrive, Exchange, OpenText Content Server or LiveLink, Documentum, file shares, PST files out on the network still. You may use G Suite, or you may use tools like Box. How many different places is content in your organization? How many places is content that you don't know about, right? How do you perform consistent information governance when you have a disparate set of data sources like this, right? How do you get your arms around that problem? Where do you start? Well, the old adage is every journey begins with the first step, right? So if you're building an information governance program, if you're trying to get an information governance strategy in place, having executive sponsorship is always a good place to start, because if it's a top-down approach, you get buy-in from all the departments, you get buy-ins from all the interested parties, right? Find an executive sponsor, make information governance a priority and a top-down initiative in the organization, right? And it's a lot easier to bring together the different resources because it is very much a cross-functional activity. Second is begin to discover and analyze what's out there, right? Use tools like file analytics to figure out what content do you have, what content is really high value, what content is low value but still might need to be retained, but just differently than the high value content, and what's rot and can be removed. And if you're not familiar with the term rot stands for redundant, obsolete, or trivial content, right? It's information that can really be gotten rid of. And then start to think about, where do you need to move content to? Where should you migrate content? Right, put a plan together for how you can consolidate systems, you can modernize, you can move some things to the cloud. Start to develop timelines and map information as you move it over to systems so it's still usable. Users can still find it. Your security models are still managed. And then start to manage information going forward. Not just from a governance standpoint, analyzing and things like that, or putting metadata on stuff, but also managing retention. Classify, retain, and dispose of content as it goes through its life cycle and as it reaches the end of its life cycle. Don't just go through this process of getting this great governance program in place and cleaning things and consolidating things just to let the problem start to grow all over again, this time maybe just in the cloud, right? That doesn't help. So let's talk a little bit about each one of those steps. Discover and analyze, right? File analytics software lets you go out and discover content and data sources that are out there and then analyze the content in those different data sources. Data sources are all the things we talked about earlier: email, file sharing platforms, content management systems, and more, right? One of the first things often you need to do is just figure out how many data sources do you have. And I don't mean how many different systems you have within a system. Within SharePoint, how many sites do you have? Do you know? Within OneDrive, we had one client, they said, we were talking about file analytics with Gimel Altitude, and their first question was, it's not that I don't know what's in my OneDrive, I don't even know how many OneDrive locations I have. And getting that information wasn't easy. So step one was kind of the discovery and figuring out how many targets there were within a data source like OneDrive, or how many PST files were out across the network before they even began the analysis. And then once you know that, begin the analysis step, right? How old is some of the data? How long have files been sitting untouched on your U drive, right? If you have 5 terabytes of content sitting out there on file shares, do you know what's out there? Right? Are there project files or product files that somebody put out there 5 years ago and they've since left the company and retired, and nobody knows what the information is, but everybody's afraid to delete it because it might be important, right? Analyze that. Same thing with your email. How old is the email sitting on your email servers? Yes, you may have email archiving in place, but there may still be emails that are sitting out there that are hoarded, or there may be information stored away in PST files, right? That's still not that uncommon. And then, is there data that puts you at risk? Do users have information on their personal workstations that contains PII information or sensitive data? Or is there information in SharePoint sites that should be in more secure site locations, right? Or is there information in OneDrive about products or confidential information that should be stored more securely? File analytics let you discover that information by doing things like pattern matching, regular expressions, term searches, and looking for content and identifying that, right? Simple example. Again, we had a client, a social security number by itself wasn't considered PII. An employee's name by itself wasn't considered PII. But if a document contained an employee's name and their social security number, now that document was considered PII and had to be handled differently than other content, right? File analytics lets you do that. And then begin to get visibility, right? Do consistent analytics, right? Run analytics jobs on a monthly basis or a weekly basis, whatever frequency you need. Build up dashboards so you can see what's going on. Build up trend reports so you can do trend analysis and see how things might be changing over time, right? File analytics gives you all of those capabilities. And then look at migrating content, right? Content migration is a structured and organized way of moving information between different content repositories from maybe a legacy system into a modern solution like Microsoft 365. But it's a lot more than just a copy and a move, right? It requires analysis of what you're going to move, planning, and change management to make that successful. The first one is you don't know what you don't know, right? I say analyze again. Well, we just talked about file analytics. This is a little different analysis, right? If I'm narrowing in now on a specific content management system like Content Server or LiveLink, and I want to migrate off of that into something like Microsoft 365, step one is just figure out how many personal workspaces are there, right? What's in my enterprise workspace? How much content do I have out there? What type of content do I have? Do I have compound documents? Do I have a lot of links? What formats? How many different MIME types is my content in? And is the system I'm going to migrate it to able to handle all of those? What about long path names? right? I could have folders with extremely long names that are nested underneath each other, and by the time I migrate that information over to Microsoft 365, it may not meet the requirements of the platform, and I need to be able to adjust that. So you have to do analysis up front and then determine what you're going to move. You're not necessarily going to move everything. Simple example is just think about how many versions you may have of a document. Well, if you have a document that's in final form and it's been approved and it's an active document, but there are 30 versions of that document that it went through its initial creation and draft and approval, do you need to migrate all 30 versions? Maybe not. Maybe you just migrate the last 5. Or if you have engineering drawings that have gone through multiple revisions over time, do you need all the previous versions if that no longer reflects what's accurately out there? No, maybe you just migrate the current version. Right? So you start thinking about that and looking at things like metadata. If I have rich metadata, how am I going to map that over into my new system? Same thing with my permissions, right? If I have very granular permissions, sometimes that becomes very unwieldy and difficult to work with. And as I move to a platform like Microsoft 365, it's an opportunity to streamline my permission model and, quite frankly, make it easier to work with. But that means, do I have an information architecture in place to receive that in SharePoint? Do I have the site structure and the content types and the metadata columns and things that I need? And then the timing and execution, right? Migration can take time. If I'm migrating terabytes of content, it's not an overnight process, right? It's not necessarily an over the weekend process. It can take days or weeks. I may need to have multiple migration threads running to do it effectively in a reasonable time frame. And I have to communicate with my user community, right? To minimize disruption to them, they still need to be able to do their jobs. And as I move the information over, I want to make sure we're capturing what they need to drive adoption of the new system. And then lastly, I can calculate a return on my investment, right? If I can retire a legacy platform by doing a migration, right, I can take a look at what are the upgrade and maintenance costs on the legacy systems. What is the cost of the hardware sitting underneath that system if I have to have database servers and app servers and index servers? I can retire all that, and that may more than generate a return on investment of a migration and an information governance project. And then manage your information, right? Again, as you get your information under control, as you roll out this information governance program, make sure records management is a part of that. Compliance is an important part of information governance. Information needs to be classified, right, assigned to the appropriate record classification, and retained so that you're managing it according to corporate policy, or if you're in a regulated industry or environment, you're managing it according to the regulations so you don't put yourself at risk. So put a records retention strategy in place, and it doesn't have to be a rigorous one. It could be very simple. Do you have a retention schedule? Is it something that was used in the past with physical records and it's thousands of record classes? Maybe it's a time, again, to simplify and take more of a big bucket type approach, right? It doesn't have to be unwieldy, and do it in a way that it's non-disruptive to your users. Do you do a centralized or an in-place approach? Right? Historically, it's been difficult to achieve centralized records management where everything has to go into one Uber repository. It's just not a realistic approach. So look at doing in place potentially, right? Manage, you may have some low value information that's going to live out its life on a file system or in legacy SharePoint environments. You may have all of your high value content in SharePoint Online, right? Manage the records in place, centralize the policy management and your file plan, and push that out to the records where they're at. And you know what? The paperless office is a myth. It's still not here. So take into account your physical records as well as part of your governance program, right? Are they on site? Are they off site? Are they being managed in a completely separate system? Are they being managed in an Access database or an Excel spreadsheet, right? Bring those under your records management program. And then manage disposition. Get rid of stuff. If you're going to classify it and you're going to put it under a retention schedule, when it reaches the end of its retention schedule, dispose of it. We talk to a lot of clients, and the questions we ask are, do you have a records management program? Yes. Do you have a retention schedule? Absolutely. Do you dispose of records? No. And unfortunately, that happens more often than you would think. And this is where Gimel can help. We bring solutions to the table that can help with in-place records management for both electronic and physical records with Gimel Records Management. Content governance for SharePoint to streamline the process of getting information into Microsoft 365 in a well-described way with the right metadata, the right content types, etc. Integrating SAP and SharePoint Online so that Microsoft 365 can become the content repository behind your SAP system. Gimel Altitude for file analytics so that you can discover and remediate content across the organization. And Gimel Migration to get information moved off of legacy systems up into Microsoft 365 in an efficient manner, right? Combining the technology with the processes and the people, both from Gimel and from your organization, can help deliver that information governance solution. So that brings us to our second poll question. What's driving your information governance initiatives? So 75% of you had either in flight or were planning one. What's driving that? Is it laws or regulations? Is it a need to modernize and retire some systems? Is it you have content sprawl? Or are there security concerns? Or is it something else? Let's see what the drivers are behind your initiatives, and I'm kind of curious to see what the breakdown is. There's a lot of different things that can cause companies to take a look at information governance.
Dean, I also think this is a good time to remind people that feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section. I see a couple, but it seems that everybody is engulfed by your presentation, so that must be a good thing. But I do want to remind you that we will be doing Q&A here soon.
Okay, good point. So yeah, throw out there whatever questions you have. We'll try to answer as many as we can. And yeah, we'll share the results for this here in just a second once we get them all tabulated in the background. They're furiously adding everything up. All right, here come the results. So not a shock. Regulations, regulations and laws are driving a big piece of this. But surprisingly, or not surprisingly, modernization and system retirement are another big piece of that, right? So, ROI can be quite frankly, can more than pay for the cost of information governance. Content sprawl, security concerns, all common things that we hear from our clients. So let's see. We didn't do a demo today by design, but if you'd like to get a peek at what some of the products do, we will be sharing these slides, and these are all active links on this slide. So you can view, these are all 5 to 6 minute videos around each of the product areas. You can get an idea of what the products do, and you can request a deeper dive demo, or on the last screen, you can reach out to see a deeper dive demo around any of the product areas. And at the top as well, there are links to our YouTube channel where there's a lot of information, and the resources page on gimel.com. So we're coming around towards the bottom of the hour. I want to respect everybody's time. So at this point, we are going to open it up for questions. And Shana, I'll let you ask the questions. If you've thought of another question, feel free to put it in the Q&A section. And I'll go ahead and show the last slide here with the contact information while we answer all the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Before I go into a couple of questions we have here, I do just want to read a comment from one of our attendees regarding the last poll question. She said forced adoption of Microsoft 365 due to remote working was one of the reasons that their organization was looking into information governance strategies now. So another good point to bring up with the Microsoft 365 features. But as we go into our Q&A, the first one we have is, what platforms does Gimel Migration support?
Gimel Migration is designed to migrate content from OpenText Content Server, OpenText Live Link, or OpenText Documentum to Microsoft 365. It can also migrate content off of a file system into Microsoft 365. So it's all about getting content into the cloud.
Great. And then can you explain what information architecture is a little bit more?
Yeah, information architecture typically refers to when you're deploying SharePoint Online, for example. Information architecture refers to your site structure, for example. How are you just going to have a whole bunch of sites out there that are all unrelated to one another, or are you going to kind of have a structure of maybe hub sites? So I have operations-oriented sites, and I have business function-related sites, or I have employee-related site, project-related sites. And then underneath those hubs, I've got my legal site, my HR site, or underneath operations, I've got my environmental health and safety site, and I've got my operations site. And it refers to the structure of your sites, as well as to then within those sites, how consistent do I lay out my library structure, right? In every site that anybody would go to, am I going to have an administration library, a documents library, a policies library? So there's a level of consistency as a user as I move from site to site. Same thing with my content types or document types. Some systems call them object types, right? If I have a contract, does it always have the same metadata regardless of where, which site I might be in and have a contract, so that there's consistency across the system from a user perspective as I'm working and moving between different locations in Microsoft 365. And then as I'm migrating content over, right, if I'm bringing contracts or I'm bringing safety documents or I'm bringing standard operating procedures out of content server into Microsoft 365, I have the appropriate metadata columns that I can map from content server into Microsoft 365. So now as users move into the new environment, they're still searching around some of the same information. They can find, sort, and use the information effectively. And then the same is true with permissions, right? Setting up the permission models so that I still have the right security and the right access controls and everything else set up. So thinking that through on the target side, Microsoft 365, so as I do the migration, that architecture supports it. Bit of a
Great.
long-winded answer.
Yeah. Well, I will say we are a couple minutes over, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the Q&A there. If we didn't get to your question, we're going to follow up via email. If anyone can think of any more questions, our contact information is right there on the screen. You can also email us right there at info@gimel.com or visit our website. For those interested in the recording of this webinar, we will be sending it out between 24 to 48 hours in the form of a thank you email. We also hope that we see everybody again next week for our webinar on physical records management, how to ensure compliance. But thank you everybody for joining today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.